My name is Hillary Foster, and when I was 32 years old, I had to stand there and watch my own father do something I will never be able to forget for as long as I live. It was Christmas night, and the air outside was so cold it felt like tiny needles pressing into your skin. I watched my father tip my grandfather's wheelchair right over into a deep pile of snow. The chair landed hard on its side, and the wheels just kept spinning freely in the air. In the quiet of that frozen night, you could hear the bad wheel making a slow ticking sound, like a clock that had no idea it was time to stop. My grandfather, Walter Foster, was a very proud man, even though he only weighed 88 pounds by then. He was wearing a wet wool coat, and the people who shared his very own last name simply shut the door on him without thinking twice. My only crime that evening was that I had spoken up for him. I had stood up for an old man at a dinner table, and my father responded by hitting me across the face with his open hand, right in front of 12 of our relatives, who all suddenly found their dinner plates to be the most fascinating things they had ever seen in their lives. I genuinely believe that night was the night we lost everything. But 10 weeks after that terrible evening in the snow, a lawyer slid a folder across a very shiny conference table and told me what my grandfather had really been doing all those quiet years when everyone else had written him off. The amount of money involved was so large it could not fit on a single line of paper. To understand how we arrived at that Christmas night, you need to know something about who I was and who my grandfather was before any of it happened. I make food for a living. I have spent 12 years working in professional kitchens, and for the 4 years leading up to that Christmas, I was a second in command at a well-regarded restaurant downtown, the kind of place that prides itself on ingredients sourced directly from local farms. That February, the owner finally said the words I had been working toward since the day I finished cooking school. He called me chef. I was going to have my own team, my own menu, and my name written on the board for everyone who walked through the door to see. I did not get there easily. I got there with burns on my arms, double shifts that left me barely standing, and years of living in a tiny apartment I paid for entirely on my own. It was only 20 minutes from a neighborhood where I grew up, and no one had ever given me a head start in any of it. I liked it that way. I was proud of every hard-earned inch. The only person in my life who seemed genuinely proud of me was my grandfather, Walter Foster. Most people who were close to him called him Walt, though by that point in his life, there weren't many people in our family he was close to at all. He had suffered a health problem with his brain 3 years earlier, when he was 75, and after that he had to move into my parents' large, comfortable house in a neighborhood called Halewood. He was given a room on the ground floor that used to be a home office. I called him every Sunday without fail, and twice a month I would drive out to visit him, bringing warm soup in a jar and sitting with him while his hands kept themselves busy. His hands were never still, even after his right leg lost most of its strength. My parents spoke about him the way people talk about a household problem that costs too much to fix, like a leaking roof that never quite stops dripping. My mother, Linda, would sigh and mention the expense of his care, as though she were lifting something far too heavy. My father, Russell, would typically just leave the room whenever Walt's name came up. I could not understand it then. How does a man raise you and feed you and build something from nothing for your sake, only for you to look at him with that much coldness? I kept telling myself there had to be a reason. There was a reason. It just took me a very long time to learn what it was. The invitation for a Christmas dinner came over the phone in the middle of December, and it came with conditions attached. My mother called on a Tuesday while I was in the middle of prepping the kitchen for service. She got directly to the point, the way she always did. Dinner was at 7. Then she paused and said, "Please, Hillary, don't let your grandfather make a scene." She called it production. I asked what she meant. She said our relatives were coming, and the evening needed to look a certain way. The wheelchair, she explained, made the room feel like a hospital. She even suggested, in a perfectly pleasant voice, that perhaps he would be more comfortable eating dinner early in his room before the other guests arrived. I pressed the phone against my shoulder and kept cutting vegetables, because I knew if I stopped moving my hands, I would say something I couldn't take back. Then my sister Brooke picked up the phone. She was 29 and had never once felt bad about anything she had ever done. She spent 4 minutes telling me about the expensive watch our parents had given her, and then she told me cheerfully that I should just leave the old man at home so I could actually enjoy myself for once. I told her I was bringing him regardless. There was a long silence on the line that told me everything I needed to know about how the night was going to go. I told them I would manage his chair and his food entirely on my own, and they wouldn't have to lift a finger. What I didn't tell them was that I had already decided he was going to have one genuinely wonderful Christmas in that house while he still had the chance. I bought him a brand new soft shirt and ironed it myself before we left. I should have listened to that silence, as the warning it clearly was. Instead, I just kept believing that no one would be cruel to an old man on Christmas Day. We arrived at the house 15 minutes before 7, and the trouble began the moment we came through the door. There was no space at the table for the wheelchair. 12 people were seated in a dining room, designed comfortably for 10. When I tried to wheel Walt toward an open spot along the wall, my father stepped directly into our path. He looked at the wheelchair, the way you look at something unpleasant that has found its way into a clean room. He called it an eyesore out loud, with other people sitting right there. Then he took the handles himself and pushed Walt into the far corner of the room, the difficult corner where the bad wood would catch on the metal floor strip every time it moved. Walt did not say a word. He folded his hands in his lap and watched everyone around him with his calm, quiet eyes. Dinner was served on the best china with expensive cuts of meat, and every traditional side dish arranged beautifully on the table. My mother served everyone. When I asked her for a plate for my grandfather, she gestured toward the kitchen and said there were leftovers from lunch, cold ham, and a piece of old bread. I had spent the entire morning preparing a slow-cooked meat dish with red sauce, a recipe Walt himself had taught my grandmother to make 40 years ago. I brought it in a covered dish, hoping to share it at the table, but my mother left it sitting on the kitchen counter as though it were a jacket someone had forgotten to take with them. Brooke was laughing at something on her phone. Our relatives were discussing a vacation. My father sat at the head of the table carving the meat. He looked down the length of the room at his own father sitting alone in the corner and said words I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said, "You do not get a seat at this table." The room went completely still. Walt smiled just slightly and said something very quiet in return. He said, "You sat at many of mine." My father's face went white. He set the carving knife down very slowly. I did not understand in that moment why a comment about chairs had produced that reaction in him. I should have stayed quiet. I know that is what people say you are supposed to do in situations like that. Stay quiet and wait. But I had just watched a 78-year-old man accept cold ham off a paper towel, while his family pretended he was not in the room. Something in me simply stood up. I said clearly that this man was my father's father, and that they were treating him like a dog they had shoved into a corner. My mother told me to lower my voice. I didn't. I said there were 12 adults in that room, and not one of them had thought to give him a proper chair. My father walked around the table toward me. I thought he wanted to talk, to take the conversation somewhere more private, to do the sensible thing. Instead, he hit me. His open hand connected with the side of my face hard enough to turn my head and make my ear ring. Every relative at that table looked down at their plates. Brooke turned away, but not quickly enough to hide the small smile at the corner of her mouth. Walt tried to push himself to standing even though his body was shaking and his leg would not hold him properly. I went to him so he wouldn't fall. My face was burning, but my voice came out steady. I told my father that he had just struck me for asking him to behave decently toward another human being. He told me that neither of us had a seat at his table. Standing there in that moment, I understood that this had never been about a chair. It was about who they had decided belonged in their family and who did not. My grandfather squeezed my hand and looked completely unsurprised, and that, more than anything else that had happened that evening, was the thing that frightened me most, and why Mother opened the front door to the freezing night and asked us both to leave. She said the way you cancel a subscription, a flat and practiced pleasantness. She called my grandfather dead weight. We went. I did not make a speech on the way out. I simply moved the chair toward the door so that everyone watching would understand that if he was leaving, I was leaving too, and that I was choosing it freely. Not one of the adults in that room said a single word to stop us. The loudest sound in the house as we moved through the hall was the ticking of that bad wheel on the floor. My father followed us to the porch to make certain we went, then stepped back inside and locked the door. We were alone on the frozen grass. I could see my grandfather's breath rising in the dark air. Strangely, I felt calm. I wrapped my coat over his legs, and we started moving across the yard toward the street. Getting to the car was harder than I expected. The wheels hit a patch of ice, and the chair tipped over into a snowbank. I righted it as quickly as I could. He was wet through, and his hands were turning red from the cold. I got him to the car, settled him into the seat, turned the heat as high as it would go, and gave him my gloves. He told me he was perfectly fine and that I drove too fast. I talked to him the entire 20 minutes back to my apartment just to keep him alert and present. I had to carry him up the stairs because the wheelchair wouldn't fit through the narrow turn on the landing. I put him in my bed with every blanket I owned and sat beside him with warm soup until the shivering slowed and finally stopped. When he fell asleep, I sat on the floor and tried to work out how I was going to manage everything financially. What I didn't know then was that the cold from that night had settled into his lungs and that his time was already running shorter than either of us understood. We built a small life together in that apartment. I slept on the couch and told him it was good for my back. I helped him through his mornings and went to work. When I came home each evening, he would be sitting by the window with his small carving knife and a piece of wood, working quietly in the last of the afternoon light. I fixed the bad wheel on his chair. I noticed he had carved the letters W and O into the armrest and asked him about it. He said it was just an old habit. That night, he finished carving a small bird, a wren, that looked so lifelike I half expected it to move. He told me his own father had taught him how to carve them when he was young. He said the wren is a small bird that gets very little respect until it opens its mouth, and then everyone has to listen. I didn't understand then why he told me that. I do now. Money became genuinely difficult. His medication was expensive. I took on every extra shift I could find and cut out everything that was essential. My mother called once and told me I could come back to their house, but only without my grandfather. I told her that comfort wasn't worth that price and hung up. I looked at the man sleeping in my bed, the man who had never once in my life made me feel like a burden, and I knew with complete certainty that I had made the right choice. One afternoon, we were in a hardware store, and a man stopped and stared at Walt for a long moment. He said Walt looked exactly like a man he had worked for years ago, someone he described as the best in the business. Walt just smiled and said he had a common sort of face. I asked him later who that man thought he was, but Walt changed the subject and I let it go. My family kept sending messages. Brooke sent a photograph of her watch and referred to my grandfather as a charity case. I blocked every one of their numbers. The apartment became noticeably quieter and more peaceful almost immediately. Walt told me I didn't have to fight his battles for him. I told him I wasn't fighting for him. I was simply done with him entirely. In late January, Walt started telling me more about his life. He mentioned a woodworking shop he had run and a company he had built called Foster and Sons. He said that people had taken everything from him once, that they had stolen what he built by forging his signature on documents. But instead of spending his remaining strength fighting in the courts, he had walked away and built something new, something much larger, entirely in secret. He said that people can take what you build, but they can never take who you are. I thought it was simply a thing a wise old man says. I didn't understand yet that he was telling me his actual history. A letter arrived addressed to him from a firm called Crane and Holloway. It was formal and serious and referenced something called Ashford Mill. Walt told me it was old paperwork and to leave it alone, but his expression when he said it was not the expression of a man discussing something unimportant. I searched the name on my phone and found that Ashford Mill was a large and successful furniture manufacturing company. I could not reconcile the image of my grandfather unable to afford his own medication with any connection to a business of that scale. I asked him about it again. He asked me to trust him and leave it alone. So I did it. We had one genuinely beautiful day in February. I cooked the slow-cooked meat dish with red sauce, the recipe he had given my grandmother decades before, and we ate it together at my small kitchen table. He loved it. Afterward, he pressed a carved wren into my hand, the most detailed one he had ever made. He said he only carved them for people who would never leave him out in the cold. I have kept it with me every day since. Not long after that, he became seriously ill. A deep cough, a fever that wouldn't break. I called for an ambulance and packed a bag for him, making sure to include the letter from Crane and Holloway and the carved bird. My parents appeared at the hospital. but the performance they gave of concerned family members was clearly constructed for benefit of the other people in the waiting room. My mother was more interested in locating his paperwork than in how he was feeling. One night, Walt woke very clear-headed and told me not to argue with my parents about the funeral arrangements. He told me to call a man named Tom Crane. He said the lawyer would explain everything. He repeated once more that people can take what you build, but never who you are. He died early the following morning while I was holding his hand. I was devastated in the way you are devastated when someone who was a fixed point in your world is suddenly gone. But I stayed busy because staying busy was the only way I knew how to hold myself together. I called Tom Crane, and he called back within the hour. He said there was a great deal to discuss. My parents took over funeral arrangements and handled everything as cheaply as possible. They did not ask me to speak. I found my mother alone in her kitchen one evening, and she looked genuinely frightened in a way I had not seen before. She told me she had grown up without money and had spent her whole life terrified of returning to that. I felt something close to sympathy for a moment, just a moment, before she became cold and sharp again. I filed the feeling away and said nothing. After the funeral, Tom Crane called us all to a meeting at his firm's offices downtown. My parents, my sister, and I took the elevator to a high floor in a glass building I had driven past 100 times without ever going inside. In the hallway, I noticed the company's logo on the wall. It was a carved wren. Beneath it were the letters W and O, and the full name, Wren and Oak. The same letters my grandfather had carved quietly into the armrest of his wheelchair while sitting by my window in the afternoons. In the conference room, the lawyer explained everything with great patience and precision. Walt's original company, Foster & Sons, had been stolen from him years earlier when my father and another man forged his signature on legal documents and transferred ownership. Walt had known exactly what had happened, but chose not to fight it in the courts. Instead, he had walked away and built an entirely new company called Wren and Oak, a furniture manufacturer that had grown over the years into something worth more than $1 billion. The company my grandfather had quietly constructed from nothing while my father treated him like an inconvenience had since purchased the debt on my father's business and acquired a mortgage on my parent house. The people who had pushed an 88-pound man out into the snow in a wheelchair were living in a house that belonged, in every legal sense that mattered to him. The lawyer then confirmed what Walt had arranged before his death. I was the sole heir. Everything came to me. My father stood up from the table and began shouting. My mother wept and spoke about how much she had loved Walt, in the voice of a person discovering love for the first time now, that it carried a dollar amount. I looked at them both and said what I had needed to say for a long time. I told them they had struck me across the face for asking them to be kind, and that no amount of tears or raised voices in a lawyer's office was ever going to make them into the kind of person Walt had been. I told them the law would handle the rest, and I meant it. My father was charged with elder financial abuse and fraud. My parents lost the house and the business. The company Walt built now has my name at the top of it, but I try to run it the way he would have, quietly and honestly and with genuine care for the people who show up every day and do the work. I kept his wheelchair in my office. Every Friday, the workers of the factory share a meal together, the same slow-cooked dish with red sauce that Walt taught my grandmother to make, that he taught me to make, that I will teach anyone who wants to learn. They don't all know the full story behind the tradition, but they know that someone in that building cares whether they are warm and fed and treated with dignity. My grandfather spent the last chapter of his life in a corner of a room that his own son had pushed him into. He never raised his voice about it. He never asked for pity or fought for recognition. He just sat quietly by a window and carved small birds and waited for truth to do what truth eventually does when you have the patience to let it work. He proved that genuine wealth is not what you accumulate. It is who you remain when everything has been taken from you and you still choose to be good. I keep the carved wren on my desk where I can see it every single day. It is small and plain, and it looks exactly like something that could be overlooked. But when I look at it, I hear my grandfather's voice telling me that the wren is a small bird that gets very little respect, right up until the moment it opens its mouth. Then everyone has to listen. I think about that every time I walk into a room where someone is being treated like they don't belong at the table. They always belong at the table.